Good morning. Good morning. Allow me to welcome you all to a special edition of our weekly Faith and Life Forum. Every Sunday morning at 9:30 a.m., we present leading scholars of religion, artists, and intellectuals to help us explore matters of faith and public life. Through lecture, dialogue, and debate, the mission of the Faith and Life Forum is to enrich personal faith by expanding our awareness of the important and pivotal role religion plays across space and time. One of the particular issues that the Memorial Church has sought to address is the relationship between faith and public service. In talking to many of our students at the college, a large number are people of faith. They believe in public service and activism. But many are not necessarily clear on the relationship between the two. This is to say, faith is viewed as something personal and private, while public service and discourse is viewed as wholly independent. Religiously motivated citizens are often tempted to split their identities and censor their religious commitments to engage in the public realm. But as Professor Michael Sandel encouraged us Friday night at the Harvard Divinity School campaign launch, we must overcome the allergy of bringing the language of morality and virtue into the public sphere. Whether conservative or progressive, we can argue conceptions of the right, the good, and the just without having to abandon the religious traditions that inform us from the outset. This is why last year we heard from Karen Hughes, former White House advisor to George W. Bush, in the ways that her faith informed her call to service. And in the same vein, we are so pleased to have two more former White House advisors with us this morning, in the persons of Joshua DuBois and David Gergen. Joshua DuBois is the former head of the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships and the Executive Office of the President of the United States under President Barack Obama. Mr. DuBois is a graduate of Boston University with a bachelor's degree in political science, and then went on to earn a master's degree in public affairs from the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton University. On the 2008 campaign trail of then Senator Obama, Joshua DuBois was in charge of the religious outreach and is widely credited with disrupting the quote-unquote evangelical Republican Party union that many other Democratic strategists wrote off as inevitable and as immutable. Currently, he writes a weekly religion column for Newsweek and the Daily Beast, and he is the author of The President's Devotional, based on the daily meditations he would send President Obama when he served in the White House. We are so glad to have Joshua DuBois with us on this morning and look forward to having him back on tomorrow night, as he is our 2014 William Belden Noble Lecturer. This morning, Mr. DuBois will be in conversation with someone who is no stranger to us here at Harvard and the Memorial Church, Professor David Gergen. Professor Gergen is the professor of public leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School and has advised Presidents Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and William Jefferson Clinton. You can read about his experiences in his New York Times bestseller, Eyewitness to Power: The Essence of Leadership, Nixon to Clinton. You can also see Professor Gergen on most evenings on CNN, where he serves as a senior political analyst. Professor Gergen is a friend of the Memorial Church and has served as a wealth of wisdom and, I must say, friend to me. Hence, it's a real privilege and pleasure to have him join us on this morning to welcome our special guest and our 2014 Noble Lecturer, Joshua DuBois. We will listen to Mr. DuBois and Professor Gergen for just under 30 minutes, and then we will open it up for a short Q&A. Please make your questions clear and concise so that we can field as many questions as possible in our limited time together this morning. And now I present to you David Gergen, and our 2014 Nobel Lecturer, Joshua DuBois.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you especially, Joshua, for coming here and blessing us this morning. We're delighted to have you here. You know, we at the Kennedy School let you slip away to Princeton. I'm not quite sure how, but we do forgive you.
I'm sorry about that.
I think it would be helpful. You rose to prominence and became a spiritual advisor to the President of the United States at basically the age of 26. Even by the lights of Bill Gates, that's a pretty extraordinary rise. So let's start with your journey. You have written in the past that there were some long nights of struggle with homelessness and poverty and desperation.
That's right. So I was born in Bar Harbor, Maine, and then moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where much of my family is. My mother and father experienced a pretty rough breakup, and after that, my mother and I were alone. She actually moved to Cambridge and went to Cambridge College here, but we actually lived in a homeless shelter at the same time. Worked her way through graduate school there, and she's just had a phenomenal journey ever since. She's actually now a vice president at Vanderbilt University, so just a wonderful story on her own. She met my stepfather, who was a minister, and we moved back to Nashville, and I grew up a preacher's kid from that point on. Left Nashville and went to Boston University for undergrad.
Did you go to Boston University because of Martin Luther King?
That was one of the major reasons, yes. Mm-hmm. I'd heard of his time in graduate school, and I knew that was a transformative experience for him. Was also, for some odd reason, growing up in Nashville, a huge Red Sox fan too, and so I have to admit that was a part of the equation as well. So went to BU. Although I had grown up in the church, I couldn't necessarily consider myself a Christian. I sort of understood the bureaucracy of religion, but didn't really have a personal faith myself until I came to Boston and went to a small church here, actually in Cambridge, Calvary Praise and Worship Center.
It's a Pentecostal church.
Pentecostal church. Met in the Tobin School, a middle school here, and found my faith at that congregation. Around the same time, I became interested in politics. A dear friend of mine, Eugene Schneeberg, who actually invited me to church, also decided to run for city council in Boston and asked me to be his campaign manager. And I can say now that it was the worst city council campaign in the history of Boston politics.
Win or lose?
Oh, absolutely, we lost. I mean, I don't think we even convinced all of Eugene's family to vote for him. But it got my taste wet for politics at that point.
You also became something of a social activist after the Diallo shooting in New York.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, you know, up until that point, I had felt much of a call into the public square. You know, I wasn't active in the campus government or NAACP, but there was something about that incident that there's a man named Amadou Diallo, of course, who was a young African immigrant who was accosted on a city street in New York. He pulled out his wallet to provide his identification to a police officer, and the officer shot him 41 times. And I sort of followed the case as it progressed, and then at the conclusion of the process, the officers who shot Diallo were acquitted on all charges, and it just sort of broke my heart. And I just thought there was no recompense for this man's life, and I wanted to do something. And so I went to the center of campus there at BU and just held a sign with his name on it for 41 hours, an hour
for each. For 41 hours.
For each bullet that was fired, and never done anything like that before. Again, wasn't an activist, but just it sort of, you know, it broke my heart, and so I wanted to make sure that this man's name was written down in the world somewhere, and so that's how that started. Yeah.
Well, you certainly have a persistence about you. You were turned down, sort of, you know, to formal note to go work for Senator Obama, and you said, "I think I'll go to the office."
That's right.
Knock on the door.
Yeah. So that's an interesting story. I was wrapping up my time at the Woodrow Wilson School in graduate school and doing an internship on Capitol Hill, actually for Charlie Rangel, congressman from New York. It was 2004, and I was in a restaurant, the Hawk and Dove. I'm sure you've seen it on Pennsylvania.
I've eaten there.
That's right.
Pretty noisy.
That's right, pretty noisy. But this particular evening in July of 2004, they were playing, the televisions were playing the Democratic National Convention And there was this young state senator from Illinois who I'd never heard of before with a very odd name, Barack Obama, who was giving this wonderful speech. He talked about all the policy issues that I cared about in healthcare and equality and so forth. And then out of nowhere he said, "And we serve an awesome God in the blue states." And I thought, my goodness, this is a Democrat who gets the language of values. I heard echoes of that great worship song, "Our God is an Awesome God." And I thought, for the first time, there was a elected official who was combining both the policies that really motivated my desire to be in politics with the language and framing of values. And so I decided I wanted to work for him. But he didn't have a position open for me, and so I wrote a number of letters and got a lot of form letter responses and showed up at his office a few times until they eventually gave me an interview, basically. Yeah.
Now, when he moved to the White House, and he appointed you to run the faith-based and neighborhood partnership office, mm-hmm. Were you also then helping him with his own spirituality?
Well,
I was curious how the devotionals
started. Well, when I first started working for him, I wasn't that close with then Senator Obama personally at all. I was just a junior staffer in the Senate office, and then we moved into the 2008 campaign. And again, I was just one of thousands of people doing outreach around the country. And really, this came about, the devotionals, because one day I was kind of in my regular morning prayer, and I thought, this is a guy in Senator Obama who has all sorts of supports around him. He's got policy advisors, political supporters. I just wondered who was thinking about his soul. And so I decided to see if I could get his personal email address. I reached out to my friend Reggie Love, his body man, and I asked Reggie if he thought it was a good idea to email a devotional to the senator. And Reggie said, "Actually, man, I don't think it's a good idea," but he did give me the personal email, and I drafted up a little note. The first one was a meditation on the 23rd Psalm and a poem that I loved by Wendell Berry called "The Faith of Wild Things," and just about how to find rest and restoration in tough times. And I sent it off to him, to his BlackBerry. About 3 or 4 minutes, he wrote back and said, "Joshua, I don't know how you did this, but this is exactly what I needed this morning. Would you mind sending these every day?" And 6 years later, I've been emailing them every morning. Every day, yeah.
Do you write them? When do you write them?
Oftentimes on the Saturday preceding, I go out to a little dock by over the water by Reagan Airport, and my wife lets me spend 5 or 6 hours out there and drafting up a number for the coming week, and then I send them each morning.
So you take your Bible.
That's right.
But you have all these references to Bob Dylan and other sort of cultural figures. You have quotes from them. You sit on the dock. How many books do you have out there?
Well, I have my laptop, which is helpful in this new media age. And so I'll have a music program called Spotify running on shuffle, which, pulling up all sorts of songs from artists that I love, Nina Simone and Bob Dylan and anyone else. And so sometimes they will inspire, and I'll bring out different books and compendiums of quotations and so forth. And,
you seem to introduce into these devotionals strong emphasis upon joy.
Yeah.
And dancing.
That's right. Yeah, there's one about Bob Dylan and quotes one of his famous songs. And I've found in my time in the White House that it's very easy to just look at the task right in front of you, but not really zoom out and pull back and see, a broader perspective that this is a wonderful time. It's a tremendous opportunity. It's a great responsibility as well, but a wonderful opportunity to shape the policies that guide this nation and to serve the American people. And there should be a sense of joy in that. And I wanted to remind the president of that.
Is he still turning to your devotionals?
He does, yeah. He still reads them, every morning.
Good.
Yeah.
And there's a little prayer at the end.
Yeah, they always conclude with a prayer. Yeah.
It's your own handwritten prayer. I mean, your own. Right. It comes from you.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So it's been interesting, and people continue to puzzle about how his faith affects him as president. It's been said that he does not go to church regularly in Washington, but he uses a lot of religious language in his speeches. It's clear that it's there in his mind, and it's part of who he is. Tell us a little bit. Help us understand how it does affect him in the exercise of the office.
I think his faith is a settling force for him.
A steadying.
A settling and a steadying force, and it allows him to really have a sense that life is bigger than even the toughest challenges that he's facing on a given day. That when walks out of the White House for the last time, there will be some things that are lasting. His relationship with his family, his relationship with God, and I think his faith reminds him of those constants in life. I think it also connects him with some people who truly care about him, and not just because of what he can do for them or his power, but they care about his soul. He has a great group of supportive pastors who come in from time to time into the Oval Office, or every now and then I'll send a devotional on their behalf, and he's grown quite close to them. People like Reverend Joseph Lowery, the great civil rights leader, but Pastor Joel Hunter, a great pastor from Florida, and others. And so I think that's an important part of his faith, is his connection with these faith leaders.
Billy Graham used to preach, and then he would pray with presidents in the Oval Office. Do these spiritual figures, do they pray with the president?
They do, yes. They come in, particularly Joel, a woman named Bishop Vashti McKenzie, and Sharon Watkins, the head of the Disciples of Christ, and some others do spend time in prayer with him. Every year, we started a great tradition about 6 years ago. On his birthday, he hosts a call with 5 or 6 pastors around the country to pray for him for the year that was and the year to come. And so they do spend time in prayer. We actually visited with Billy Graham one time.
In Montreat.
In Montreat, that's right. He's the first sitting president. Many presidents, of course, have visited him, but the first sitting president to go to Montreat. And just a tremendous experience, and just to see that.
Yeah, winding up that hill.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
It's I had the opportunity to visit with him maybe 3 or 4 years ago. 3 years ago, and it was a special experience. Yeah. But tell me, how does faith inform what he believes is right in public policy?
I think he has a driving sense of protecting the least of these, those who are most marginalized, and I think that has been informed by his faith. Interestingly, although he's not Catholic, there's a real sort of knowledge and a power of Catholic social teaching in his life for a particular reason. When he began as an organizer in Chicago, he was supported by the Catholic Campaign for Human Development and surrounded by all these Catholic priests. One of his great inspirations in that first year in Chicago was he went to a organizing forum where Cardinal Joseph Bernardin was a guest speaker, and Bernardin, started talking about the seamless garment of life, where you don't just care about people at the beginning and end of life and at birth and death, but about their human dignity all the way in between, and that was, I think, a formative experience for the young man. Yeah.
You've reflected a good deal on this, just because you've been there so long now, about what role religion should play in the public square. It was during the civil rights movement that the conservatives felt, why are all these church people getting involved in basically an issue of public policy? Why are they pushing their views as religious people? And today, of course, people on the left ask, why are all these conservatives getting involved in pushing their views on abortion and other things? Why are they? There's an argument today on the left that it's inappropriate for people of faith to try to impose what they say impose on others, a particular view of how life should be lived according to their reading of Scripture. So how do you come out on that? What's the right answer?
Well, I think my friends on the left and in progressive communities need not fear moral discourse. We are inherently moral beings. We may not all be religious people or adhering to any religion or the same religion, but we don't operate in the world on the basis of 10-point plans and facts and figures. We operate and we do the things that we think are right, and that sense of rightness is grounded in some set of moral principles. For some of us, that's religion, and for others, it's other sets of principles. And so I think to really, truly resonate with people, to connect with their minds and not just, with their hearts and not just with their minds, progressive communities have to be able to engage in that moral discourse. And the wonderful thing is there are so many people of deep faith and values even within progressive communities, among Democrats on the Hill. I wrote a piece for Newsweek called The Secret Faith of Washington, just sort of uncover some of this. Senator Amy Klobuchar, for example, is this wonderful woman, but doesn't talk a whole lot about her faith. But spend a few minutes asking her what's most important in her life, and you find out that she is a person of strong faith. Her faith has helped her navigate her career in public service. It anchored her in tough personal moments. She talked about, I talk in the piece about how she was able to push through her father's alcoholism because of her faith. And so all these people have these stories, but they're afraid to open their mouths and let them out.
See, the argument that faith strengthens the individual, that argument I think is compelling for people across all divides. It's a harder question when it becomes, my faith tells me that on something on abortion. Now, let's take a famous example, Governor Cuomo, the former Governor Cuomo, or the earlier one. He, by his faith, said, I don't believe in capital punishment, I'm against it. But as governor of all the people, I think I should respect the will of the people. And that was an interesting argument, and I'm just curious about your own view on that.
So I believe that when we enter the public square, we have to use arguments that are accessible to all people, those of our faith and those who are not of our faith. And so we can't say, I'm voting for this bill or I'm supporting this policy because my religion or my God tells me so. We have to use something that, we have to deploy arguments that would be accessible to people of no faith at all. That said, we can talk about how our values are formed, how we arrived at that point. And so I think there's a nuanced line there. But when it comes to that final decision, we have to use language and framing that would be accessible to anyone.
Is it appropriate for someone who has a certain belief to then sort of essentially try to persuade the country of his belief or her belief, religious belief?
I think outside of elected officials, those who are elected to represent everyone, then sure. We live in a country where our Constitution protects the ability of anyone to say pretty much anything they want. And if I want to seek to persuade you of my religious principles and why my religious principles should cause you to think a certain way, then it's my right to do that. I personally don't think that's the most effective way to persuade people. I think
Mitt Romney faced this, of course, as a Mormon. That was used against him because he would bring a certain set of views to the Oval Office that would be unacceptable to a wide number of people.
And Kennedy faced it, of course,
as well. He certainly faced it as well. That's right.
And so, I think at that level, it's incumbent upon those who are seeking office to make it clear that they will not be making decisions on the basis of their faith.
Of their faith alone.
Of their faith alone. Yes.
Yeah. Right. They'll take into account other considerations. It is a democratic country.
Exactly.
And you have to represent. You have to some extent, respect the views.
That's right.
At least try to understand and respect. It has been widely reported that you had a sharp defect. I think you wrote about this or referred to it in your book. And I commend this book to you. Can it be found at the Harvard Coop? Do you know?
Yes, I believe so.
It can be found at the Harvard Coop. It's called The President's Devotional. And Joshua put this together from the many devotionals he sent to the president. But you apparently had a sharp disagreement with the White House over health care, the Affordable Care Act, and how it would apply to Catholic hospitals.
Yeah, well, so I talk about this in an essay on disagreement. We had a significant difference over the accommodation of both Catholic and other nonprofit organizations, religious organizations, that initially were not significantly accommodated, and they would have to provide access to contraceptive services when that's something that they disagreed with. We have since, I should note, moved to a place, or the administration has moved to a place where a robust accommodation exists, where a third party will provide these services, and a lot of independent analysts say that accommodation is sufficient to protect religious liberty. The essay, though, was less about the policy difference, although it's important, and certainly
it was a question of religious liberty versus women's. Often, values are in conflict.
That's right, and what I sought to illustrate in the essay was, how I manage difference. Because this was such a big deal for the president, I thought it was going to shape his future relationship with religious communities into the future. And I've been through other debates, but none as intense as this one. I really sort of took it personally. I brought it home with me. I think I started demonizing opponents and really, not putting myself in the shoes of those on the other side, until someone, a very wise person in the White House, reminded me that as intense as I felt about religious liberty and these religious principles, folks on the other side felt just as strongly about the protection of women's rights, as I do as well, of course. But and that they are not bad people. They're not, I should not question their motives, and that we need to fight as hard as we can on the playing field, but then leave it there. And so I sort of it was a growing and learning experience for me, just being a part of that debate.
You also you did win a major fight in the White House earlier on about inviting Rick Warren, the conservative evangelical at Saddleback, to come to the president's and provide a prayer at the president's first inaugural.
Yeah. Well, I should say it wasn't just me that was. I think it was a moment where we grappled with difference in our country, and that you have this president who's very, very strong on LGBT rights, and increasingly strong, and and I think that's exactly where he should be, but can also engage the evangelical community, folks who disagree with him, and send a signal that this is a country where we can respect difference. It's interesting that just in the last few weeks we've had a number of debates around the same set of issues, from World Vision, the International Development Organization, and they're shifting policies on LGBT rights, to, I believe, the head of Mozilla, the software firm, who was just recently forced to resign. So I don't think this is a question that we figured out, whether we can live in a country where we have increasingly progressive views and expanding equality on the one hand, but also parts of the religious community on the other that still maintain pretty conservative interpretations of Scripture.
You and I talked about this earlier. Do you think it's possible to build for each evangelicals, say on the left, like a Jim Wallace, mm-hmm. or you, or to a Rick Warren on the right, as a way to break through some of the political deadlock in the country? As we talked about earlier before we came out here, Rick Warren on the right shares a lot of your views about poverty mm-hmm. and about the environment, not on other things, but on those two issues. Yeah, there's a bridge.
I think we have to, as you mentioned, start on with the issues that there is a tremendous amount of common ground on. Poverty certainly is one. Environment, human trafficking. There's been a degree of bipartisan consensus on that, increasingly, and I'm very excited about this, around the issue of criminal justice reform. You see conservative Christian organizations like Prison Fellowship aligning with very progressive groups and liberals to say that we've got to do something about the war on drugs and the school-to-prison pipeline that's affecting far too many young people. And so I think it's moving from the sort of the 10,000-foot debates about theology down to very practical issues on which we can work on together. Yeah.
That's interesting. I'm glad you raised this question about criminal justice, because one of the most moving pieces that you've written was a long piece in Newsweek on black men.
Thank you. Yeah.
And you pointed out that slavery existed in this country for nearly 250 years, but then sort of Jim Crow kind of laws, and then in effect oppressive laws continued. And you made the argument that since the 1980s, we've had this dramatic increase in incarceration. And the number of young men who are swept up, black men who are swept up in the system of incarceration now exceeds the number of slaves in 1850.
That's right. Yeah.
I was quite stunned by that.
Yeah, and obviously our population was a lot smaller then, of course, but it still is a stunning figure. I think the reality is this is a demographic in our country, a group of Americans who went through a lot of tough times, of course, that were not of their own choosing, from slavery through Jim Crow and the subsequent impacts. And then around the 1970s, we just sort of told these guys to figure it out, right? 200 years of systemic disinvestment and subjugation, that's going to have an impact on anyone, any race, any person, right? And then, after the Civil Rights Act of '64 and Voting Rights Act of '65, and we just sort of thought that everything would be okay, and it's not okay, and a lot of these young men did not figure it out. was compounded by the fact that in the 1980s we started this thing called the war on drugs, sort of a get-tough approach to criminal justice issues that unfortunately swept up a lot of nonviolent drug offenders into its net. A lot of folks think that that was because of the crack cocaine epidemic in the 80s and 90s, but the reality is the vast majority of arrests, felony arrests, were for simple marijuana possession. The vast majority, like I think 60% or more. There's a wonderful book called The New Jim Crow, where a woman named Michelle Alexander walks through this phenomenon in detail. And so now you have the young men who are saddled with felony records, who were removed from their families for a period of time because of imprisonment, and did not have the opportunity to be the sort of fathers and husbands and so forth that they would have liked to have been, and they're transitioning back into society. Their sons are feeling the same effects, and it's a vicious cycle. Now the helpful thing is that people are waking up to this. They're waking up to the policies that we need to change in terms of the criminal justice system, but also to the need to really pay attention to these young men. Have a sense that they're all of our sons, all of our brothers, and that if they're falling behind, our country's going to fall behind. But if we can get them to a better place, they can be tremendous assets for all of us, and that's what the piece was all about.
Yeah, let me ask you, help us understand this. I went with a group of students in January to New York, and we went, among other things, to the Bronx Defenders Association, which has been fighting stop and frisk.
Yeah.
And they made a very strong argument that stop and frisk applied aggressively is quite intentionally a form of social control. That this was an effort to control the black community and to make sure they knew who was in charge. And it was a view widespread in that organization. Yeah. And I'm curious, is that, as the African-American community looked back over the last 20 years of criminal justice, 30 years, is that a view that's widely held in the black community? And is it one that seeps into your thinking as well?
I think it is. I would not go so far as to say that it's an intentional strategy of social control. I don't think that there is some bureau of control out there that's saying we need to figure out how to keep black folks in line. That said, it sort of seeps into the subconscious. A researcher named Dr. Phil Goff at UCLA has done some great work in this space. And he found that when most people look at kids, young black men, 10, 11 years old, or young black boys, I shouldn't even say men, they endow them with much more sort of decision-making authority, responsibility, over their own actions and than we would of any other kid of that age. We sort of we project upon them our own fears. We forget that they're kids, simply kids, and because we've sort of created this idea, this monster out of them that doesn't really exist, then that's something that needs to be controlled because we become afraid of them. I think the most basic thing that we can do to roll this back, and it's starting to happen around the country, is really get to know these young men, get to know these kids. Jeffrey Canada, the head of the Harlem Children's Zone, one of the most effective nonprofits in this space, says that it really boils down to first knowing these young men and then liking them. You can't serve someone you don't like, and they're just kids like anyone else. They have hopes and dreams and insecurities and fears, and sometimes they express those insecurities in ways that may seem to us aggressive or whatever. That's just because they haven't figured out their own bodies yet, their own selves, just like any other. I know I was an awkward kid at 13 myself, and so I think we must move into a posture of really getting to know these young men. And then, I think our social services should flow from that.
Yeah. President Obama has started this, and we're going to come to you in just a moment. I think the hook is almost here. But I'd like
slowly approaching.
To make sure we cover two other points. President Obama has started this organization called My Brother's Keeper. That's right. And he seems to be, in his second term, speaking much more to these issues of young boys and young men, especially from minority communities, and what can be done. And Michelle Obama has said that this might well be central to what he does after his presidency. I'm just curious where you think this effort.
Yeah,
My Brother's Keeper's going.
I'm very excited about it. I've been very much a part of some of the work in this space. For those that don't know, the president has called together 10 foundations and is starting to work his way through corporations and faith communities and others. They've made an initial commitment of $200 million to invest in strategies that empower these young men and make sure that they are able to start life on the right path. I do think it will be an important part of not only his legacy from the White House, but what he does after he leaves office. We focused on 5 intervention areas. I won't bore you with them, but if you'd like to know more about it, please ask. I think we are subtly sort of shifting to a place where it's not just the African American community's problem in terms of handling these men, but that it's it's an American issue, and I think that's a good thing. Yeah.
And finally, your own organization you've started called Values Partnership.
That's right. So Values Partnerships is a social consultancy that helps foundations and nonprofits that are secular, that are non-sectarian, partner with the faith community to solve big challenges. And so, for example, we're working with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and another organization on a project to build faith community partnerships on public health, and another foundation to build a national network of faith communities on environmental issues and addressing climate change. And basically, these sectors are working on many of the same things, but they've never partnered before, and we're helping to bring those relationships together.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Terrific. Jonathan, do you, we would, any reflections from you, from the pulpit?
No, I want to open it up to our wonderful guests here. I want to give them ample opportunity and time to receive their questions. So if you have a question, if you could just raise your hand, and we'll make sure we have a microphone for you.
Don't be shy. There's one over here, please. Oh, there's a microphone coming. Thank you.
I've read very little or heard very little about Michelle Obama's faith background, and I'm interested in what you can say about that, still respecting her privacy, and also how the girls are being introduced to religion in the family.
It's a great question. The First Lady grew up in the church in the south side of Chicago. Interestingly enough, this is not related to her own faith, but she has cousins that are African American, but a part of the Jewish community in Chicago. They are converts in Chicago, and she has a cousin who's actually a rabbi, believe it or not. She attends worship services as often as she can, and the family can at St. John's Episcopal Church there in Lafayette Square in Washington, and ensures that the girls' faith is cultivated through some private Sunday schools and some other things that occur. The White House had been sworn to secrecy around some of them, but it is an important part of her life.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Joshua. You've spoken about the relationship between faith and morality in the public square and public leadership. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the relationship between faith and morality and the marketplace and our business leadership, and particularly through your sort of values partnership, what opportunities do you think there are for the sort of great global corporations in America and elsewhere around the world to partner on issues on poverty and environment?
You should know that Jane has spent years working with corporate social responsibility and issues.
Well, I think it's a phenomenal question, and thank you for asking it. I think there's tremendous growth potential in that space. But I do think that an increasing number of CEOs and other folks in the business community are interested in how to incorporate values into their business model. My friend Jim Wallace has done great work at the World Economic Forum, bringing this conversation to that table in Davos. We have begun gently consulting with a few Fortune 500 companies about how to grapple with issues of values in the context of their business. I think the reason I say growth potential is that these companies have innovated in every other aspect of their business model, their supply chains, their hiring practices, and so forth. But when it comes to community engagement, and specifically faith-based engagement, I don't think we've seen a wave of innovation just yet there. And so I think there's tremendous room to speak into that. Values partnerships will certainly seek to do it, but perhaps we could dialogue about that further, because I think there's a lot more work to be done.
I actually do have a question.
Sure.
Something I would love for you to address. And one of the things that I touched on in your introduction was the way that you many people credit you with disrupting what was seen as a immutable evangelical Republican Party alliance, right? And some of that has been touched on, Professor Gergen, about issues that we share in common. I was wondering if you also could possibly speak about the definition of what it means to be evangelical and how so much of that may have been surrendered or framed by media and the like, and how you were able to distinguish.
It's a great question. Well, in terms of we obviously reached out to diverse communities, from diverse faiths, progressive communities, and so forth on the 2008 and 2012 campaigns and in the White House. In terms of our evangelical outreach specifically, it was really rooted in relationship. We created opportunities for the president and for our senior staff and others to dialogue with leaders in the evangelical community, to go to church together, to break bread together, and realize that they in fact had some things in common. And that was what sort of slowly started breaking the walls down. There was just the sense before that they're not allowed to be in the same room, and so we created opportunities for them to be in the same space. The question of what defines an evangelical, I think, is a fascinating one, and one that a lot of people are grappling with right now. The traditional definition would be sort of a belief in the inerrancy of Scripture and a preeminent focus on spreading the gospel. Go ye therefore into all the world. I think, though, the evangelical community is sort of unfortunately redefining that. At least some folks are, to say that an evangelical is someone who is an advocate for issues of human sexuality and around abortion. Interestingly enough, and ironically, that may inhibit their ability to spread the gospel, right? Because they're closing all sorts of doors that might otherwise be open to the sharing and the spreading of their faith. And so that's a part of what I'm going to talk about tomorrow in tomorrow night's lecture, is the fact that the core purpose of an evangelical is supposed to be to go out and spread the gospel. But because of the way that I think too many folks have approached the political aspects of evangelicalism, their ability to spread the message of Jesus is limited.
Please, if we have is there a microphone? Yeah, please.
It seems to me that one of the major problems in our society stems from a tension between something quintessentially American, which is an emphasis on individualism, and a tradition that goes back to our earliest history that fosters that. And on the other hand, the need for community. And that tension between individualism and community, and the idea that we are all in this together, that we sink or fall, we sink or we drown, or we survive together. And it seems to me that that is very much related to at least our moral commitments, if not our faith commitments. And I wonder if you have a sense that a concern with those sorts of issues rise at all up in the discourse in Washington.
It's a great question, and David, I'd love for you to reflect on that a bit, if you don't mind. Just my very brief thoughts are that is that sense that we rise or fall together is very much a part of the holiest text of most faiths as well. A notion of community, of sacrificing for one another, and so I think it's woven into our religious discourse. No one has spoken more eloquently to these issues than Bob Putnam right here at Harvard. But David, I don't know if you.
Well, I have some concern that I think the tension you described is right. I have some concern that tension is being politicized, so that the right sees itself as holding up the banner of individualism, and the left sees itself holding up the banner of community, and people on the right don't think they can support community because that's the other side. And it does seem to make it much more difficult to build bridges across, which are so vital to get us out of the sort of the political mess we're in. And so, belief in community should not be the preserve of progressives. It's wider than that. And in earlier days, people who believed in individualism also understood the importance of community. If you read de Tocqueville, it's woven together. America's a very individualistic nation, but one of the things he was struck by was the willingness to go help build somebody else's barn when it burned down, and everybody got together, and voluntary associations were central to what de Tocqueville found in America, and somehow we've separated them out, and I think in an unhealthy way. You started things up here, going.
Could you speak a little bit about the history of the office at the White House? Sure. And the continuity of its mission? Because I think it started under President Bush that it was set up, and it continued under the present administration, and how that affects the mission of the office as such. I understand they have some funds available also to further their effectiveness, which are outside the oversight of Congress and so forth, and how this all works, and that would be great.
It's a great question. I'll try to be brief. Actually, the first faith-based office was, little known fact, started in the Clinton administration under Secretary Cuomo at HUD. They began a faith-based initiative at the Department of Housing and Urban Development to engage faith communities on homelessness issues and on home ownership as well, but expanded dramatically in the Bush administration. Really rooted in the idea that there was an unequal playing field, unlevel playing field, and faith-based organizations that wanted to compete for federal grants and resources were discriminated against. And the Bush administration studied this, and they put forth some persuasive evidence to that effect, and opened up faith-based offices within federal agencies to address that discrimination and to level the playing field. And so that focus on federal grants, federal dollars, was the driving focus of the Bush faith-based initiative. We changed things a bit in 2009 when we started the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Changed more than the name. It's a subtle shift, but an important one. I think the Bush administration did phenomenal work engaging faith communities. I have dear friends that worked for that office. In fact, a very dear friend in John Doolio, the first head of the Bush Faith-Based Initiative. That said, when I was on the 2008 campaign, traveling around, meeting with pastors around the country, and I asked them about the faith-based initiative, they had one very specific impression, that there was some big pot of money somewhere in the White House that everyone sort of knew about, but no one knew how to access. And so that was how pastors saw the federal faith-based initiative. And so we knew expectations were wildly out of whack, that there were far more organizations out there than there were grants available. And so we had to create opportunities for religious communities to engage the federal government outside of federal grants. Ways for us to be a resource to them outside of just doling out money to these organizations. And so we created a set of programs we called civic partnerships, non-financial partnerships, ways that we could support their capacity building, connect them with one another, raise the profile of successful efforts, but not give them a federal grant because there wasn't enough federal money to go around, particularly in 2009 and 2010 when we were in the economic downturn that we were in. So we started a program called Job Clubs where we helped churches set up job training programs. We started an effort to help churches connect with, and other synagogues and temples connect with their local public school and be a resource to their public school. All of these efforts were, I think, a real resource to the congregations, but were not about giving them federal grants. And so that shift in focus from grants alone to non-financial partnerships, I think, is the defining difference between the Bush Faith-Based Initiative and the Obama Faith-Based Initiative.
Let me go back just a little earlier, where I think religion began to play a larger role in the politics of the White House, which led to the faith-based initiatives. And that was, for a long, long time, most of our history, mainstream Protestant groups controlled our, the people who were elected to the White House tended to come from mainstream Protestant, and it was more a question of private faith. And there was a large body of people, the evangelicals, who stayed on the sidelines in politics. They thought, this is not for us, don't get involved. And then a couple of things happened. We had the prayer in schools decision, which alienated a lot of the evangelicals. And then, importantly, we had the Roe v. Wade decision, which also, of course, in 1973 made a major difference. And that's when the evangelicals said, we have to get into politics to protect our values and our traditions. And so the first time they really got into politics at the presidential level was when Jimmy Carter ran in 1976. He was an evangelical. And they came out in droves in the South to support Jimmy Carter, thinking he would be one of them. And Jews, frankly, were worried about it because they thought he would be too much one of them. They thought it was going to hurt Israel. Well, Carter turned out to be in the more progressive tradition, and the evangelicals who had poured out for him, and he had somebody in the White House who was the outreach person to the evangelicals, they turned their backs on Carter and the Democratic Party. And that's when Reagan hired a religious, and he set up in his campaign, a religious team to reach out to the evangelicals and bring them over into the Republican Party. And that's when the evangelicals began to move from Democratic to Republican, and it's never been the same since. And we've had this association of evangelicals more on the right than the left. Right. But both parties have been actively now seeking out ways to get people of faith to come to them and vote for them by appealing in some ways to their religious faith. Right. And that led to the faith-based initiatives. That's the politics I live through.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
I think there was one other hand here somewhere I didn't say, please.
Well, we have to call time now, unfortunately. But listen, please join me in extending our love and appreciation to Professor David Gergen and Joshua DuBois for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Joshua. Thank you so much.
The Faith and Life Forum is here every Sunday morning during term at 9:30 a.m. We typically meet up in the Pusey room. Please check your schedule on the website so that you can join us. We have some other fantastic speakers that are scheduled for the rest of the term, which include Sharon Kugler, the chaplain from Yale University, as well as Gustav Niebuhr, former religion writer for the New York Times and professor of religion and media at Syracuse University that will be with us in a few weeks. So check the schedule and come out every Sunday morning at 9:30 so that you can be a part of wonderful conversation and dialogue such as this that we enjoyed this morning. Right now, we invite you to join us for some coffee and refreshments until the 11 a.m. service. You can join us right in the memorial room here, off in front of the south porch, to continue this conversation and dialogue. And we also really encourage you to come out tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. right here in the sanctuary to hear our 2014 William Noble lecture in the form of Joshua DuBois. And then his book, Harvard Bookstore, will be here on site. Selling copies of his book, where he's agreed to sign copies as we have a wine and cheese reception immediately following his lecture on tomorrow evening. So get on the phone, text some people, spread the word. All of this crew here, get on Twitter and Facebook. I know how active you are there. Spread the word. Let people know to come join us on tomorrow evening. Thank you for being here. We'll see you over in the memorial room.